The battle to secure voting rights for women and their subsequent rise in political power is a great American story. It's a big national story with familiar and not so familiar names and places, and much of it played out right here in the Empire State. The struggle for women's voting rights in the U.S. was political and it was messy. Many men stood in the way, but so did many women. The New York State Association opposed to women's suffrage was one of the most active anti-suffrage organizations in the country, and many prominent New York women were among its members. The fight over women's right to vote has its roots in the struggle for women's rights.
Life in the 19th century for white women was one that tended to be very confined. There are ranges, but they tended to be very limited. Women were not allowed to make decisions for themselves. Their fathers made their decisions until they married. Their husbands made their decisions until he died.
Is she without rights? Oh, it's way beyond that. She is without personhood. Once you marry, you become dead in the law. It's the legal code in common law. That means that you, of course, have no right to your body. A husband can beat his wife as long as he does not inflict permanent injury.
Northern white women first began to organize around the idea of women's rights in the 1840s. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which many consider an important date in the movement for suffrage, was actually organized as a meeting on women's rights. It wasn't until the very end, and after considerable debate, that the convention voted to include a resolution on voting rights for women. There were Black women in the movement. Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman were popular and active. But there were no Black women invited or in attendance at the Seneca Falls Convention.
I want to tell a story about Harriet Tubman that I think really illustrates what happens during this early period. Well, one time she was traveling with a white woman, Emily Howland, and they traveled together. They get to the train station and Emily goes off. She comes back in the morning and Harriet Tubman is sitting in the train station. And she said something about, well, where did you stay? She had no place to stay. She sat up on a bench in a train station all night long. When Black women traveled, they would have to stay with someone. That shows you how complicated it was to think about just the logistics of travel.
As the Civil War approached, another issue took center stage. The abolition of slavery was seen as a moral imperative by progressive Northern white women. The issue of voting rights for women was temporarily put on hold.
And what they're doing is they're setting aside those goals in order to support the Union, to support the federal government, and to support the abolition of slavery, which of course is one of the major, is the cause of the Civil War.
Women's rights advocates, including many here in New York, supported the Civil War as a way to abolish slavery. As they organized and raised money for the Union, their political influence grew.
Now, the significance of this is that it's at a time when Abraham Lincoln is saying this war is being fought to preserve the Union. And they're saying, no, we won't support it. And women are raising money that really is the backbone of the medical care of the soldiers. And so they've got some money behind them as they're speaking to Lincoln. And the number of signatures they gather, they are a strong, powerful force in forcing Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
After the war, women suffragists who had worked on behalf of the Union felt they were owed the right to vote. Suffrage leaders closely monitored the legislation coming out of Washington after the Civil War. Progressive white suffragists celebrated the passage of the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery. But the suffragists objected to the 14th Amendment, which failed to extend equal protection to women, and to the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the vote but excluded both Black and white women. To suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, the proposed 14th and 15th Amendments were an affront. In response, the singularly focused Anthony aligned herself with Southern segregationists.
The National American Woman Suffrage Association took this position. Their argument was, if you want to maintain white supremacy, if you want to maintain the supremacy of those born in the United States against immigrants, against African Americans, you want to support women's suffrage. They could have made a different alliance, but they chose to ally with Southern segregationists, with Southern racists, with Southern white supremacists.
The 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1870. Susan B. Anthony lost the battle. The repercussions of her choices are debated to this day. As I said at the start of this report, this is a messy political story. The next 50 years would see a fractured but consistent campaign to push the idea of suffrage forward. It was a long struggle. In 1917, New York voters, all men at the time, voted to amend the state constitution and grant women full suffrage. It was a cause for celebration, but there was still much work to be done. The ultimate prize, federal voting rights for women, was still only a dream.